Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. First of all, Happy New Year to you all, and I hope 2024 will be your best year yet. If you're new to this podcast, over the last 2 years, I've interviewed over 170 people around this question. It's never been my intention to find a universal answer or define the good life. It's more asking people, what is a good life for you? So, really, by sharing other people's explorations around this question, I'm really trying to help you to find and define your own answer to this question by evoking your own line of self inquiry. On the 51st episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, I'm delighted to introduce Richard Merrick as our guest. Richard is a writer who, after decades of working within the walls of convention, writes about the journey from working for others to finding our own path outside those walls, and supports small groups as they make theirs by walking with them. In this conversation, we explore the conditions that Richard incorporates into conversation groups to heighten connection, authenticity, and engagement with the unknown and what is. We delve into the importance of letting go of being right, not having set objectives and agendas, disengaging to re-engage, and turning up as who we are. We discuss the value of engaging with the unknown for building trust, our ability to make discoveries, for making real human connection, and for the melting of the old to form the new. We also explore the role the artisan plays in ushering in the new. For this project or otherwise, Richard is one of the wisest people I've talked to, typified by consistently reading 3 books a week for almost 50 years, and yet maintaining his continued willingness to engage with not knowing in various aspects of life. There's so much to take from this episode regarding how you engage with other people, yourself, and life itself. And it may considerably alter your perspective on how you approach various relationships, be it at work or in your personal life. Look, I took a hell of a lot from this conversation. As I mentioned, I think Richard is a rare, wise individual, and I hope that you're going to take a lot from this conversation as well. And if you enjoy this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you're on the podcasting platforms, please continue to leave your lovely reviews, as I greatly appreciate your support at this stage of my podcasting journey. So without further ado, the 51st episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Richard, thank you very, very much for joining me on the What is a Good Life podcast today. After our last conversation, I've been very much looking forward to this. So thank you for joining me.
It's good to be here.
So, Richard, as I tend to kick these things off with, it is with the question of, is there a question you're trying to answer as you move through life?
At this point, what strikes me is that this sense that um, the workplace and society is moving faster than organizations can keep up, and that as individuals and employees, we're paying the price. Whether that's in terms of direction, whether it's in terms of mental health, and they're all linked. We find ourselves, I think, on a coach where we don't know the driver. And what came up for me, and it started during lockdown, was that whilst we're all there being good corporate citizens and we're doing all the things that we're supposed to do, all of us have a voice. All of us have something that is about our work as expression of who we are, not just work as something that we do. And there's an area in there that, as sort of organisations at the moment are thrashing around for control in what is a very sort of volatile workspace, and as technology disrupts the skills base, so that a lot of the time the things that we've been trained and educated, encouraged and bonused and motivated to do is going to be heavily disrupted by technology that does the anodyne stuff better than we do. And our value comes from thinking the unthinkable, what Jung would call the unthought known. And these ideas that we all have perspectives that are about far more than our intellect. We have a presence with who we, the communities we're in, and we sense things, we see things, we have things that we can't articulate, and all of those are there like pieces of a jigsaw. And my interest is in finding a space where we can put all those jigsaw pieces into one place. Normally in small groups. I mean, I find the bigger the group, the more complex the web of relationships, and the more the more safe the environment has to be, to the point of being vanilla. The real work, the real energy comes when you've got small groups. I find around 8, where people they've developed a relationship, that there's a basis of trust there. And then you can get into the things that matter. You can pick these jigsaw pieces up and start playing with them and looking at where they might fit in the knowledge that none of you know. So it's a bit like children at play. And we get into that area where none of us are right, none of us know, but actually we know that there's something there. And I think what that relates to is, again, different for all of us and where we are in our lives. But there is something there about who we are and why we are where we are now. And going back to the point at which you started this conversation, is what's the direction of your life? And it's not woo, and it's not, these are really substantial questions. And I think it was sort of brought into focus really during lockdown, where all of the things we just accepted as day to day, this is what work looks like and this is how we do it, all got thrown into confusion. And then we got into hybrid working and working from office and all of those things that we found that we had to do during lockdown. And then somebody said, okay, it's over. Okay, come on back to work now. But during that space, in that space that we had doing that, we're never going to go back to normal because I think we see things differently. It's not a question of just going back. It's a question of society has changed. I think our levels of uncertainty have changed. That was the academic. That was the pandemic. What's next? And I think as things like climate change become more visibly present to us, there is this underlying side for a lot of people. Well, this is what's my life. What am I doing with this? And actually, the classic recipe of you go to school, you then work for 20 or 30 years, and then you do other stuff. No longer works. I think the things that people are looking for is money. And once you've got enough money, it gets fairly boring for most people. And I think there's a huge awareness of within community, within ourselves, that there are things that we want from life and we can contribute to life. And I think maybe that's the bigger part. Wanting stuff from life, that's easy. We know how to do that as consumers. But it's not about consuming life, it's generating life. It's the things we see, the things we feel, those sort of thoughts that we don't quite often have the space to speak, that are important. And I think it's that. When the people I work with, there's a classic question in coaching. You wait till the end, and then you say to somebody, and is there anything else? And then you get quite on, you go, woof. And I think that's a general sort of condition with people at the moment. There is lots of, if we were just going around to people in the street and saying, is there anything else? It'd take you all day to get down the street. Yeah. Because there's all these things, there's all these, various ideas, fears, whole range of things that people are carrying around with them that there is no space to deal with. So people are sort of hanging on to them and thinking it's about them and not other people. And so I think the area which you and I have spoken about, which is this idea of having, we sort of term them a bit clumsily really, but conversations without agenda, which is what's going on. And just what's going on with people with no particular end in mind. Just, how are you? Really? And we've often said in these groups that they're not therapy, but there is something therapeutic about them. And it used to be the time at one point back in great grandfather's day, it was the stuff that was done at the pub or a church on a Sunday morning, because that's where you went on a Sunday morning. And it was communities who you were close to and knew. And as we become more fragmented and as we become busier, we don't get those safe spaces. We don't get those, I use the word advisedly, we don't get those sacred moments where we can just be who we are with other people. And I think it matters.
It's I love this sense that it's not therapy, but it's therapeutic. What role do you see these kind of these spaces fulfilling for people?
Again, choice of words. There's a sort of sanctuary aspect about it. One of the things that was really interesting in these groups that we've talked about, the Thursday and Friday groups, was that as people started to go back to work, and because they run one late on a Thursday, one late on a Friday, late afternoon, early evening, but people were
And
getting.
sorry, Richard, could you just explain to anyone just what these groups are about, how they came to be?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Right back at the beginning of lockdown, I was working with two constituencies in as a coach. One was people, and one was sets of people in fairly conventional business settings, where it's about evidence and data and performance and structure and models and how do you do that. And at the other end, it was a more metaphysical community. There were people in indigenous wisdoms, psychodrama, shamans, all of whom were looking at the world from a different place. And actually, I loved working with both of them. Very different. And what I found with it, though, was that if you're trying to get them to talk to each other, they'd talk to each other, but on the basis that they were right.
Right.
And lockdown offered an opportunity because I just put two groups together, 10 on a Thursday, 10 on a Friday, on Zoom, 2 hours, turn up. What does the world know? With what's going on at the moment, what does the world look like from where you are? And we were saying earlier, it wasn't designed to be clever. I think it turned out to be clever because there was no objective. There was nothing to prove. There was nothing we were trying to solve. There was nowhere we were trying to get to. It was a little bit digitally looking out of your window and saying, what's going on? And my Jungian friends would refer to it as reverie, but there is just something in there of just relaxing and here's what it looks like from here. And it's easy to forget now, isn't it? Just how existential the threat was at that time. People around us were dying. And so there was something about this space where it was just a place where people could come together and look at what was going on. And the conversations always went somewhere. Something would come up we'd check in. Everybody would check in and say what they were seeing. Something would come up and then that idea would take control of the conversation until we checked out. And it was the same every week. And when it came to it, when we were coming sort of back out of lockdown and people were having more difficulty making the Zoom sessions, they were in their cars or whatever it was, I asked the question and said, look, there's nothing that says these things have to continue. Have they done their job? And there was a really quite visceral reaction to it, which is no, they haven't done their job. They're doing the job. And the comment that stands out for me was somebody said, I need to know these conversations are happening, even if I can't make it. If I can't make it, I just need to know that this conversation is happening. And if I was available, I could be there. And if I get space, I can join it at whatever point whatever point, even if it's 10 minutes from the end, I can still join it. And so there is something in there about, I think variously, the community, the idea that nobody has to perform. It's about mutual support, mutual recognition. It's not carrying any performance load. It's just turning up and people being recognized for who they are. And it does use words that we don't normally use in business. We talk about soul, we talk about love, in terms of what was going on. So the conversations happened, I think, on the boundary of where most of the conversations people have end.
Yeah.
And so it was that recognition of our humanity. And it's sometimes the words are difficult because it's easy to label it and saying, oh, there we go. They were very human, very powerful, and very important, and remain so, conversations.
What is it about this way of conversing, Richard? Because, I've talked to you obviously once before this, and it was supposed to be a 30-minute conversation, and we got into it for around 90 minutes. A mutual connection of ours, Dan Lawrence, who is a podcast guest as
Yeah.
well. I have similar experiences with him, which I assume you do too as well, based on what he's said to me before. And I don't know, there seems to be something about this when you're saying this is a conversation on the boundary of where people usually stop. I think there's there's this kind of sadness that I have sometimes about the conversations that we're having. Sadness might be a bit too heavy a word, but that we're really underutilizing each other in I don't mean this in like a transactional exchange, but even in the words that you're using there, even if it was in the sense of support or love, um, where we could be kind of granting each other this sense of support or even aliveness, but we've decided to just, that's a boundary here, let's say, and we're
Yeah.
not going to cross it. And just the way you're talking here, some of the elements to these conversations, like even if this was in a group setting or not, or even just with your friends, this idea that people show up, they're getting to see each other. There's no agenda, so it's kind of an organic thing. And people are letting, even with these two kind of groups that you were describing, I call them as a scientific and almost this metaphysical group,
Yeah.
that they're suspending their desire to be right. So it
Yeah.
almost seems like the condition is that there is space for something to emerge, because we're not coming in with an agenda or a preconceived notion of a place to get to.
Beautifully put. And it is, I think, just that. I think we're so used to being in performative space,
Yeah.
of having to turn up and almost to know. I was at a meeting in London last week, and the person I was with was saying the thing that's really powerful about this. He says you feel really comfortable and confident in talking about what you don't know anything about.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. And and it is that, I think, that area which is where, and it's a function of our education system. We're brought up to be right. We get marks for being right. We don't get marks for wondering. We don't get and we don't get we operate in a space of efficiency. We don't really make time for reflection. So we're very much into the doing space. And one of the people I use he's long dead now, but as a mentor was a guy called John Boyd, who was he founded the Fighter Weapons School, and he had a model called UDA Loop, which he developed when he was a fighter pilot, and it was about how to deal in the chaos of combat. And I think one of the things in there, the Yoda is observe, orient, decide, act. If you're talking to people in Sabakwa and they're in trouble, it's stop, breathe, think, act. Um, and we don't get to do that. We're in such short term performance loops that we don't get that time to pause. And I think one of the things that the conversation groups do is that they provide a space of pause. I think one of the things that, again, has turned out to be important with it is uh, there's almost an element of ritual and ceremony to it. They happen at the same time every week. We go about it the same way. We check in, we talk, we check out. Um, Lots of times people will talk to each other one on one outside of that. But it is I know at this time that is happening with these people in this way. And I can turn up there in whatever mood I am. I can be in a foul mood. I can be in a good mood. It doesn't matter. I'm recognized for who I am. I don't have to be anything in order to enter. And one of the most common comments, and this has been the case all along, when people leave the group, they actually say they have more energy when they leave than when they came in.
Hmm.
And given that these are discussions happening at 5:30 on a Thursday and 4:30 on a Friday, um, I actually find that quite powerful. It is as though they come into the thing and all this stuff they're carrying, they get to put down, and then they go and have a weekend.
You know, it reminds me of what some friends say to me sometimes when we go into certain conversations, and they say something to the effect, I might get a text afterwards, even though what we discussed was kind of heavy, I still feel very light,
Yeah,
or it felt very light. And I think, look, while I'm not suggesting that everyone just opens up with their heaviest trauma or something like this, and they just start having these conversations with people and they haven't explored anything, but I also think we've kind of ring fenced off just talking about what could be relatively straightforward emotional things that we just don't reference in conversations. You know, this could be for the someone could think this could be something for my therapist or something like that, where just for someone to say up and state how they feel, I think there's a great liberation to that, because what you're talking about, I think a few times when you say this performance thing, it makes me feel like we're putting on an act so much.
Yeah.
Like it's not only hitting goals, but it's also being quite performative in how we're describing things. And I don't know, I have this feeling that when you said there that somebody said, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I feel like I'm an expert in talking about it. Because I think if I were to make a hazard and a guess or an assumption would be that they're talking about their direct experience,
Yeah.
which you're the only person that truly actually knows what your own direct experience of
Yeah.
life is right now.
There was a thing when you were talking about Dan. I met Dan in London last week on Monday. He's the reverie man for me. But one of the things we found ourselves talking about was a conversation not unlike this. And he brought into it what he termed the mobility of play. And it's a lovely, I think, really powerful expression, because my wife's an early years educator. So if you look at young children, people at sort of 2, 3, if you watch them playing, they're not bothered about performance at all. They will work things out by doing things, by experimenting. They'll communicate in different ways. And I thought what Dan said captured it beautifully, which is this idea of the mobility of play. And I think a lot of the time, the way that we've been educated and trained and brought up and rewarded is that we think we have to do it in sets of rules. If the rules aren't working, try harder.
Yeah.
And instead of actually having that space where we can actually say, guys, this isn't working, what are we going to do? And that needs that area where things like sort of rank and role and expertise and all of those things have to fall away, because actually none of us know. And that needs a particular place and a particular level of trust, just to actually sort of, if you go back to the Boyd thing, it always makes me smile, having come from that world, when in the films they get really down. Oh my God, Maverick's disengaged. Of course he has. He doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah.
He's got to disengage in order to get a grip of what's going on to go back in again. And I think that's no different to us. If we're sat there, we have a choice of, we can just speak louder and try harder. And, actually sometimes you just have to stop, go for a walk, and take time out, sit by the river, come back and talk about it again. And we'll get really excited because somebody will say, that's an hour and we haven't got an hour. Well, how's it working for you now? So I think that general area of recognizing the power that we have in community, and not just this thing of bringing in individual expertise like tools, and if we actually do it, it'll all work. Sometimes we've got to make space for things that we have difficulty measuring, like wonder and awe, and curiosity, and reflection. And actually, because the answer that we're looking for is there. We were talking earlier about ideas and the idea that we think we have ideas. And quite often we're not. The ideas are out there looking for us. And sometimes if we're quiet enough, they'll come and introduce themselves. So this idea of frenetic activity, and because that's what we're supposed to do, is at this point, there was a time, if we go back to, easy for me, I can go back 20 years, and that was really important because generally speaking, the models worked. But actually the models are all breaking because the society and technology is changing, or is changing our workplace faster than organizations can cope with it. Sometimes we need to just stop and look at it and say to each other, what's going on? Things like, how do you feel? We don't say that very often in meetings. How do you feel about this? Engaging the other senses. We go through, and it's a bit like going into Gestalt. We talk about intellect, but we don't talk about emotion or intuition or physical sensation, and all of them are important. And it's not a let's go on a yoga weekend thing. These are important every day in every meeting. You can see it when you look around the meeting table. You can see who's tense. You can see who's not. You can see who's got something to say but is afraid to say it. And sometimes we just have to park that tension And no, take away from it. Let's nothing performative here. We're not going to talk about what's going on at work. How are you? What's going on for you? And have that conversation, and then go back in again to disengage in order to re-engage. And it's so obvious, and we don't do it.
Isn't it kind of crazy? Like whether this was in a meeting, in a discussion with any, like whether in work or outside of work, whatever it may be, that almost the starting point to a conversation wouldn't be how do you feel or how
Yeah,
are you? You know,
there
if
was
I'm gonna,
one of my colleagues on the Thursday group, and what we'll do sometimes in the middle of a meeting, we'll just say, let's just stop for 2 minutes. And he said that when he first did it, because he runs a big business, he said it felt a bit weird. And then he tried it himself in a meeting, and everybody looked at him, so he was a bit weird. Just let's take 2 minutes, just stop for 2 minutes, and then we'll start again. And then he said what he found interesting is that the people in that meeting who thought he was weird are doing it themselves.
yeah,
And I think it's this space for the unconventional to enter. Um, we've developed so many protocols. We have so much dogma about this is how you're supposed to act. This is what you're supposed to do. And actually, we're human. And sometimes in the middle of the tension, just stopping for a minute, um, and it's, we time it. We normally do it for 2 minutes. And on the one hand, 2 minutes is a long time, and on the other hand, it's forever. Um, but it's that discontinuity. It's actually sort of putting an interrupt into the energy and direction of the meeting, because actually it's not going where we need it to go. So we need to stop it and let it reorient. And they're really simple, really human. I mean, this is not a question if you've got to go off and do some long course on it. This is basically turning up as who we are.
And when you say that, I even think about even my wife saying that sometimes. Like, you know, just let's like we literally don't need to keep carrying on right now.
Yeah,
Like, let's just take a moment, and not even in some highly. It doesn't have to be even in a highly contentious situation. Just
yeah,
like just take a breath and let everything just settle down again, and
yeah.
then like move from that place as well. Like, I think there's it's when you say certain, like, you know, how are you feeling, and let's take a pause for a moment. Like, it's kind of amazing that these almost seem, they could seem like radical acts in a corporate environment. You
Yeah.
know, like that this would be seen as strange or something. Like, when they're so fundamental just to the human experience. Like, as you say, no wonder why Maverick disengages. He doesn't know what he's doing. He
Yeah.
doesn't know what's happening right now. He needs space. What do you think it is about that? Like, or even our idea around unfilled space, almost space for possibility. Like, is it the sense of ambiguity or uncertainty that perhaps people might associate it with it, or what do you think?
I think sometimes it's fear, because if we take it and we talk in terms of liminal space. I was smiling when you were talking about it, because when we first started having these conversations, people in the Thursday group would go, "Oh, we're going to have a weird hippie shit moment," um, and that stopped really very quickly. But I think the thing with alchemy is, it's a simple process. It breaks down. We look at the parts that are important from it. We start to reform them, and what's new comes out of it. But that liminal space where the old is melting and the new is forming um, is very challenging, particularly in organisations where people, particularly in the middle and towards the top, are really hoping it won't melt, because that's the stuff they know. That's how they've
Yeah.
got to where they go. That's where their influence and status and knowledge lies. And all this idea of new stuff coming in that they don't understand is really difficult. And it's the same. We tend to think of it. I think it's time increments. Really, if we're taking it down, we could go. It's a different. We're different every day. We walk into a different business every day. The business itself changes during the day. But somehow we think it has to behave because, for God's sake, we've written a plan, you know, um, and that's what we're supposed to be doing. And you often see these. People will talk about it outside, having a drink afterwards. We've got this plan, but we know it's crap. But nonetheless, it's almost like it's become totemic. We've got to follow it because we did it and everybody approved it. Therefore, we've got to do it. And it is that really simple bit at the edges, which is, it's the thing is, it's really simple. I think the thing that intrigues me and often infuriates me is that all we have to do is stop and ask. But we create performance cultures that are where everybody's so worried about not performing that nobody will give it the space without recognizing that what they really need right that minute is not to be looked to be, not to be seen to be performing, but to be thinking. And I think it's a challenge that it will solve itself because organizations are going to have to get to grips with it. They can't, they can go around and be in denial of it. We can't say on the one hand, it's all right now because we've got AI. If we've reduced our jobs to the point where AI can replace them, then sort of shame on us. Because it's the things that we do with AI as a complement to what we do that matters. And so I think it comes down to respect, recognition, time, not being stupid, just actually finding that space. And I think, what I'm seeing happening, not totally true. Some of the people I talk to in organizations are saying, how do we do this inside the organization? Which is quite often more difficult than having a bunch of people who don't know each other because you've got politics and whatever in it. But there are still ways, I think, and that we're experimenting with at the moment of how can you create these spaces inside an organization? The other side to it, which I've also seen, is that people are going to do it anyway. So there are areas that in technology that I'm interested in where actually the really motivated people, they go off and they meet with other people doing the same job as them in other companies and they talk about what needs doing. And the companies that they're coming from haven't a clue what's going on. I often wonder what would happen if these bunch of people that I see talking together would have an idea, all of a sudden, and they all left the business that they were part of, and the business would be going, what?
Yeah.
But it's that we're down to, again, common things. It's about being heard. It's about being recognized. It's about being heard. It's about it's okay not to know. It's about discovery happens at the conjunction of not knowing and knowing. But you've got to give them both space to appear. I mean, all you've got to do really is get old and have grey hair. That's how it works.
Well, you preempted what I was just about to ask there. What did you? What's your relationship with this kind of space of unknowing? Like, how would you say this has evolved for you? And like, at one point in your life, has this generally been the way you've seen things, or at one point in your life, would you say this is a radical departure from where you were?
It's an evolution, I think, because I'm not normal. So I spent most of my career on the edge of where either forming things or breaking things up, where there were no rules. It was, generally speaking, I did some of the first joint ventures in China. I did anti-counterfeiting in India, and generally speaking, it was just very fluid. There was no book on how to do it. And I've always enjoyed that. I was probably dropped on my head at birth, but that's what I've enjoyed. But for a long time, having said that, I read a lot because I enjoy reading a lot. But one of my defenses would be I just gather information. So you get into the middle of this where people didn't know what to do, and there'd always be something that I could bring into it as a catalyst for the discussion. But it was often based on knowledge. Right. And if I take it through to now, that's sort of got an inheritance, really. Because quite often now the thing that needs to happen is not to say anything. And even now it's a real conscious fight. And when you know people well enough, they'll say, you're doing it again. Is we're looking at a space and I'll think, I know what I could do. And it's not. Not sometimes, almost always there's a point where you've just got to stop. What needs to appear will appear. the more you try to force it into a corner, the more you try and tell it what to do, the less it cooperates. So, probably in the last 5 years, it's been, if I was graphing it, in terms of the level of change, the last 5 years has been significant. Because the way that I operate now is very different to the way that I operated 5 years ago. And if I could live to be 150, it would be very different to the way I'd be operating then. There is a joy, though, that I find to it, which is it's all right just to be you. Just turn up because you've got enough. So is everybody else. The labels we put on people and the images we project and the stories we tell about ourselves and we tell ourselves about us and us about them, are normally a nonsense. And that requires, and that's perhaps just a function of getting older, but that requires degrees of humility and keeping the ego quiet and looking at what's important and making space.
This is a lovely sentiment, or I think a realization for anyone to have, the sense of it's all right just to be you.
Yeah.
And it's I don't know if it was Oscar Wilde or something that said it's just be yourself, everyone else is already taken.
Yeah.
It's kind of, and look, the word authenticity, it kind of gives me the shivers sometimes with the way that it's used, in what I consider to be kind of a disingenuous way at times. Like it's become very trendy or something to use like that. But like really, the idea that we've had to remind ourselves to be ourselves, and just in all the kind of aspects of you're talking about, performing and performative nature and these kind of things, like it is quite like, I don't know, it is quite, there seems to be something really, that sounds like quite a contradiction in that state, like, or an oxymoron or something. Like there sounds something quite kind of funky about the idea that we have to remind ourselves to be ourselves.
Yeah. There was a time I was using one of the models I use because I find it quite fluid, is Bill Sharp's Three Horizons model if I'm talking to people. And I found myself, I was talking to somebody, well, 3-4 years ago now. And we ended up, because it was that sort of conversation, where we said that's a bit like us, isn't it? We have this idea. So here's a notion: you arrive, and we can go to the all sorts of codes on this, but let's assume for a moment. Here's a working model. You arrive, you get born, and you're given a soul. It's been used before, but it's yours for a while. Okay, rent a soul. And your only job in life is to hand that soul over in better condition than you found it. And it was quite interesting when we were talking about Three Horizons. And it was really powerful because there's, whether that's true or not, I mean, other views are available. But I think that idea of we're the only one of us there'll ever be. And there's a difference we can make while we're here. We can either embrace the challenges of doing that, some of which might quite often be difficult, or we can ignore it. And that seems a bit of a waste, really.
I've had this thought recently where our only our only role in life is to play that very unique note that we may be.
Yeah,
And that's it. And then after that, the chips may fall where they may.
yeah,
And for me anyway, it gives me a lot of peace in choices that I make, or idea or actions that I create, or whatever it may be, because I don't know, there's just, it takes a lot of pressure off.
yeah,
Like there's, because I love looking at this through different, like, lines of inquiry, whether it was, if you wanted to reduce your ego or become your natural self, or even from, let's say, a perspective I may hold, that we may be fragments of the divine, or something like this, and but you're returning to something that, even when you mentioned earlier the idea that we don't own thoughts.
yeah,
Like, I really like the idea that these things are just kind of flowing in and out of us, and that we're not owning these things, and potentially, like, even a soul, a rent a soul scenario, like that, it's just to be this unique constellation that you are right now. And
yeah,
when you mentioned some of these groups, I think that seems almost fundamentally what you're giving people the space to do as well, is to, if I'm if I'm in a pissed off mood, if I'm feeling absolutely joyous, I can show up like that, and I don't have to go through that process of putting on another layer on top of me, either to tone it down or to dial it up.
Yeah. There's a guy called, well, Sir Christopher Fraley, who was the Dean of the Royal College of Art. And he talked about villages of the mind. And I think that's one of the things that, when we're as fragmented now as we tend to be, there are areas here, there are villages of the mind. We all need somewhere to belong.
It's I don't know. There's something about a empty space becoming something that I don't know. There's just when you're saying that we all need villages to belong, there's something about an empty space and just allowing that. Like, I love the idea of bringing people together where they almost create and to steal your metaphor here, they're almost creating like a village. They're creating an experience. Even the fact that someone who's not, you mentioned earlier, that isn't on this call, still wants to know that this place exists,
Yeah.
even when they're not there. There's something like about like a, whether it's like a foundation built on reverie or
Yeah.
interconnections or whatever it may be, that something is forming in this empty space.
And the opposite is also true, of course. They need to know that it's happening, but the people who are talking know that he or she is not there, but they're present. It is. I mean, it's really. When I say simple, it's not simple, but it is quite profound. It is belonging, and workplaces, generally speaking, are not communities.
Yeah.
No matter what the HR hype may say, and people are transient, and we need somewhere rather firmer than that to belong.
Just to, when you're even there talking about the sense of belonging and maybe even belonging within ourselves, and I think something that contributes to that, which you touched on earlier, which I really like the idea of, because it's even the way I've typically framed it, what do I want from life, or helping people realize what they want from life, or living the life that they want to live, or something to this
Yeah,
effect. But I think almost a more fundamental question is, what do I want to contribute to life? And you'd mentioned this expression earlier, and I think I don't know. I think that this is almost like one of the fundamental questions that people are trying to answer at this point. And even touching on the theme that you've brought up a few times, just in COVID, helped or created the circumstances for us to question these things. But I do think that question of what do I want to contribute to life is something that goes beyond even the what do I want from life part.
yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, for my own part, at this point, in fact, I was having a discussion last week because the new Artisans thing has now been going 18 months. And we sort of uh, we had a session of saying, where do we want this to go, and what's my role in this, and Richard Merrick's role in it, which appears to be fumbling with the future, but which I quite like. But I think that we can do ourselves a disservice. We've become so attached to sort of goals and performance and outcomes that we forget just the importance of concentrating on what we're doing at the moment. So, I mean, I was actually saying, from my point of view, I'm not looking to get an outcome. I'm working on a principle. I write every day. Not because it is a discipline. I journal in the morning and I write something on new artisans. And that's a discipline. I do it because I enjoy it, and I'm trying to be a writer, and I'm trying to improve my writing, and that's the way I do it. But it's not about an outcome. It's not about trying to get something to happen. But it does sit there, and it comes from the conversations, which is that sometimes something that you write touches somebody else, and they do something slightly different. It's a bit like paying it forward. Have you ever done? I have done this. Have you ever confused people by going into a motorway toll and paying for the person behind as well?
Yeah, not in a toll, but in different other places. Yeah.
Yeah, and confuses the hell out of them. But actually, you look at what happens from them. You imagine what's happening for them. It's put them in a different place. So I think if we're whatever we're doing, if we do it on the basis of this, this might have an effect somewhere, and just trust that it does. You don't need it to come back and get a big gong, or it doesn't need that. It just needs, I think, an intent to say, in doing this, I hope it'll trigger something somewhere else, and just leave the rest of it to whatever it is.
But isn't that interesting that people that may participate in this will say that they feel lighter afterwards, or that
Yeah,
they and that we need some, like, because if you picture that, like, if you had X amount of people showing up to a certain space like this
yeah,
and everyone leaves the room feeling lighter, and picture that almost at the center point of a ripple out through how numerous interactions would go throughout
yeah.
the rest of the day, that could be the effect, or the way we might try and calculate what's the
Absolutely.
ROI on this, or whatever it may be. But we're not content with just the ripples existing. We have to measure the ripples, and
Yeah,
test how far the
yeah.
diameter of the ripples and everything else.
And I don't think I have this. One of the things in terms of this work that, let's call it work for a minute, is that there's no qualification, there's no certification. All you have to do is sit down and talk to somebody. Any of us can do it.
Yeah.
There's a book called Cascades by Greg Sittel, and he was on the ground during the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine, and he's an investigative journalist. And one of the things he noticed, he did a really good job in mapping the dynamics of that revolution. And he actually said it wasn't a movement. What there were lots and lots of small groups, all of whom had a thread of dissatisfaction with the way the country was. But they weren't in connection, they weren't talking to each other about it. But there was then a keystone event, and they all gathered around it. So it was almost like everything was prepared, and then it went. And I think there's something of that in what we do. Our workplace is going to change. The idea of being an employee in the conventional sense is either going to be scarcer or more miserable, or probably both. What we do, how we contribute, how we earn a living, we need to work that out, and nobody else is going to do it for us. What we can do is talk to each other about it. And it's about getting your retaliation in first. It's about being prepared, I think. And it's that, what do? We work as humans.
Yeah. Just intrigued for you to explain how you kind of settled on the word artisan, and the significance of that for the work you're doing.
Okay. And like most of the stuff I do, it was a place to start. From all the reading I've been doing, one of the things that I noticed was that if you take epochal change, and American Revolution, Industrial Revolution, the Renaissance, at the point at which it tips from what was into what is becoming, artisans are always there. So if you take the American Revolution, all the people who tipped that perfect good tea over the side were artisans. They're all craftspeople. Paul Revere was a silversmith. If you go to the Industrial Revolution, you've got people like Watt and Newcomen, who are actually artisan engineers. They created the machinery that then powered the revolution. And one of the reasons for that, and probably the American Revolution is the best example right now, which is that the reason that they had a structure, so they had a guild structure, there was trust. They had a common structure in how they worked and what the standards were. And so when it came to communication, they were speaking a common language. They knew each other. There was respect. There was reputation. So when they communicated, they communicated really well. And so on that cusp between the old failing and the new emerging, that level of communication and clarity was really important. And of course, the thing is with all of those artisans, it's a bit like alchemy. As soon as the job really gets going, they become irrelevant.
Hmm.
They go back to being a silversmith. But in that time in the middle where the old is failing and the new is forming, they're really important there because they make stuff. Artisans, I think there's a couple of things about it. For artisans, the work is the work. It's an expression of who they are, um, and they know how to make stuff. They know how to create stuff. So when the old is failing and the new is emerging, they're the people who know how to create. And so it's an imperfect metaphor, but like lots of these things, it was a place to start.
No, I really like that. What's You've touched on this sense a few times. The old is failing and the new is forming. Is this just an inherently messy phase? Is there anything that aids this phase? Does it have to be somewhat chaotic in order for the new to form?
I think it does. If you um, There's a great book by Margaret Wheatley called "Who Do We Choose to Be," and in it she talks about John Bagot Gubb's work and he was a military man, beginning of the 20th century, but he did a huge piece of work on civilizations. And he tracked back through 13 civilizations and looked at the commonalities, um, and looked at the phases, how they actually developed, and came up with the fact that plus or minus they lost about 250 years. And they start with the emergence of the new, quite often with invasion, being invaded. And it goes up through a commercial phase, and it ends up in decadence. Think about decadence, the people who worship a sports star, sports stars and celebrities. And it's imperfect, but like lots of these things, there is a message in it. And we can go to other things. So we can go to Brain's Gone, Homo Deus, and Brain's Gone. But lots of people who've done looking at epoch, things like Guns, Germs, and Steel. No, it's going to be messy. But I think that depends how you look at it. It'll be messy if if you're invested in the status quo. It may still be messy, but hugely liberating if you're not.
And in this, then, are we assuming some sort of, I don't know, like humanity revolution, or like a sense of humanness coming back to society? How do you kind of how would you kind of characterize how you see things coming into new?
I really don't know. And I think the thing that probably makes it different at this point compared to previously um, is we've done a pretty good job at putting the planet at risk. And so all the other epochal changes didn't have that problem.
Yeah,
And even now, there's going to be things that we think are there. There's a lovely bit I was watching, I hadn't seen it, I was in the film the other night, called Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks.
right.
And it goes back to when the U2 was shot down with Gary Powers. It was about the spy exchange. There's a lovely bit in there where Tom Hanks is talking with the East German who is the prisoner the Americans have got. And he says to him, "You're not worried?" This guy looks at him very intently and says, "Do you think that'd help?" Beautiful, really powerful, lovely line in it. And so that's where I sort of sit with it. I mean, I can't get too anxious about it really, but I think if we were to spend more time, I think, considering what it is we're doing today, and less about what we might have to do tomorrow, we might do rather better.
Yeah, yeah. In terms, Richard, then though of, I guess there seems to almost be like a coinciding between the ideas that are coming to you and this idea of a group, what's needed in society right now. It seems almost to be like a bit of an antidote then for like just some of the, not only just maybe even some of the things we were talking about in the relational restrictions and all that, but we're just in the overall lens of, or the overall umbrella of just some of the chaos that seems to be going on the planet at the moment. It seems almost like that this serves as a space where people can kind of just, I don't know, sit in this unknowing, sit even in their feelings with what they're experiencing.
Yeah,
And even if it's not to come up with a solution, I think there's just, for me anyway, on a personal level, there's a lot of peace that I can come to with just acknowledging what is.
Yep.
because it just takes away, just to kind of riff off what you said there with the Bridge of Spies with the prisoner. Do you think that would help, like, in terms of worrying? Like, there seems to be a lot of peace that can just come to acknowledging, this is how I'm feeling, this is the current situation, and just to even express that. Because I think what seems to cause a lot of suffering in people's lives is just not addressing, not even the elephant in the room, even just on a personal level, not even in
Yeah.
an overall in a societal sense, but just not addressing the obvious. And I think as humans, I don't think we realize how much extra baggage we carry by just not simply, we don't have to solve it, we don't have to figure it out, but just, somebody else sees that too, okay, I get some. And even going back to this idea you said earlier about being seen, there's just some peace that comes with that.
Yeah. I think there's and one of the problems, I don't know, one of the challenges we have is that we sort of suck it up because we have so much more we can do, from 24-hour news to Twitter to whatever it may be. We have this huge sort of, like a basking shark. We have this huge maw open to suck in all this information, um, most of which is irrelevant to us.
Yeah.
And I think the idea of being grounded with a few people is that's where to start. You don't have to stay there and hide. And But I think if you go down to, and Viktor Frankl had it nailed really in Man's Search for Meaning. And I mean, in my own thing, I'm 12 years in the Air Force, and some of that involved, doing, getting into places that, your mother should say you shouldn't really go there. And when you do that, the thing that matters is the people around you. And even in the midst of what seems like quite cruddy, really, you can actually sort of look at each other and say, "Oh, this is rubbish, isn't it?" Or words to that effect.
Yeah.
But actually, it's just for the people around you. All the stuff that's out there, all the rest of it, at that point doesn't matter. And we are each our own strategist. We deal with what we're dealing with. But I think for me, the thing the way that I understand it's not the truth. But I think connection to an idea, connection to something worthwhile, connection to people, um, and just actually doing the best you can in that space, everything else will follow.
Yeah. And just, from everything you've been saying throughout this conversation, Richard, like, even to that, like, the sense of community, the importance of support, people being seen, even engaging with some ideas like love and soul, the idea of just taking a pause, taking a break, even the sense of engaging with uncertainty, checking almost the temperature of reality, even the initial change or challenge that you said, or the question you were
Yeah,
exploring at the moment, and the pace of technology and change, and how can people and corporations keep up with that. And then also even looking from, like, what do we want from life potentially, and then maybe even evolving into what I can contribute to life. And you've shared so many kind of fascinating aspects of, I think, what contributes to a good life, even in terms of experimentation
yeah.
and play and these things. Just for the question for you, Richard, what is a good life for you, sir?
I think right now, pretty much where I am. The easiest way to be wealthy is not to need very much.
Yes.
And I don't need very much. And I appreciate what I've got.
And how would you describe what's contributed to that sense of feeling for you right now?
An absolute astonishment I've got to this point. Um, that I haven't been found out along the way. Um, and I think I'm very fortunate. Um, Good family, good health. Um, there is a point at which I think we can look at things and just appreciate the joyous absurdity of life.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think the if there is a trick to it, um, it's not to take it too seriously and not to expect too much of it. And I think we have, I have a challenge with the consumer mentality we have. And the North Americans have a mythical monster called the Wetiko. And the Wetiko is a monster whose appetite grows in direct proportion to what it consumes. So it's always ravenous.
Yeah.
And, and that seems to me quite a good metaphor sometimes for what we're doing. And we should probably stop.
Oh, I very much that very much resonates with me, Richard. There's I must check that out as well because I love this idea of something the appetite grows in direct relation to how much it
Yes.
consumes, and I think that really captures things. I was I was informed by somebody yesterday that it was Amazon Prime Day, and I just had this idea of the masters chirping like jump and everyone everyone running to their computers to buy everything, and I thought, Jesus, this
I
is
mean, you realize that Amazon would be bankrupt if it wasn't for me. People laugh at me for it, but I regard books as sort of for the work I do.
yeah, yeah.
Books as sort of stock in the working capital. You know, you've got to have something you can bring into it. So I look on average, I've read I think three books a week, probably
Wow.
for the last 50 years. So there's a few. Um,
Just bef- before I wrap up on because I was about to wrap up and then you mentioned that is there a book out of everything you've read, Richard? Is there a book that you'd like that touched you the most and that you'd think that might have wide appeal?
One in terms of what we're talking about, and it's a recent one, but it's that. It's called Crossing the Unknown Sea,
Right.
um, by David White. David White's a poet, and it's quite biographical. But he cheats because he writes about all the stuff we talk about, but he writes about it like a poet. So there's absolutely no defense against how he writes and what he writes. But he wrote that, and he wrote one subsequently called The Three Marriages, which is about our marriage to work and our marriage to ourselves, our marriage and our marriage to another. And they're both, I've really enjoyed them. And perhaps that may just be at this point. Um, but I think if you were saying to me today, given this conversation, what should I go and read? Go and read Crossing the Unknown Sea. It's an
Wonderful.
easy read, quite deep, and very thought provoking.
Richard, look, thank you very, very much for the conversation today. All that you've shared, all the ideas that you've shared, and the sentiments as well, and then this unexpected bonus of a book review as well.
Okay,
So it's been an absolute pleasure, Richard, and I look forward to carrying on the conversation.
good seeing you. Take it easy. Go well.